Time for another video, and before we get started, a huge thank you and shout out to everyone who has liked and subscribed so far. This is a channel dedicated to helping you get better at art by leveraging research from cognitive fields like neuroscience, meta-learning, and psychology to help you improve faster than all the people who don't use them. I recently passed 700 hours of trying to improve my painting and drawing skills by experimenting with these learning techniques, things like spaced repetition. I practice for just 1 hour per day with the area of study dictated by an algorithm that tells me what to work on, using flashcards that I made from popular art books. You can see a little of each day's training session in my Shorts feed where I post every day, including a short description. If you'd like to learn more about the system and how it could help you, I have a video on screen now, and there's even a Discord server dedicated to it. The flashcards I use for this experiment are all captured from books which you can view in this video. This is not my first 700 hours of drawing as a total beginner, but most of my previous experience was with copying other drawings. I started out copying anime as a teen, and got so frustrated in not being able to draw it from imagination despite all the hours spent copying that I started learning a game from scratch. I also decided to learn to paint, and I am learning that as a total beginner. These last 100 hours I had a very specific goal. I wanted to learn how colour and light worked so that I could get better at painting things from imagination, and I decided to keep learning about gesture drawing. So how did I get on? Let me start with a quick side note because apparently this is not something that's made obvious by YouTube, but every single day I post a short video of a training session, typically about 30 minutes long, condensed down to around 10 seconds. And these videos, of which there are now more than 700, actually feature a description that tells you what I worked on for that session, what book it came from, what tools I used, if I used reference or not, and where that reference came from, how long it took, and the key lesson I learned from studying it. Every single video. There's a lot of information in there, so if you want some ideas for training exercises, or you're just curious about what I was actually doing, or just want some inspiration to amp yourself up to train, be sure to click the 3 dots on a short to read about it. The same videos are also available on TikTok and Instagram, starting from around hour 100 or so, and the descriptions are more obvious there. But I thought I'd just mention it here, as it turns out not a lot of people knew about this. Let's start with drawing this time, and as I mentioned last time, I wanted to keep going with some of the Michael Hampton stuff, more gestural type things for this 100 hours, because it was making me think about drawing the human figure in more abstract terms than something like Tom Fox, where the anatomy is studied in a more specific way. The best way to think about this is that you're not practicing how to draw necessarily, but a way to draw. And those are, in my experience so far, way more powerful and give you far more returns for your efforts than honing in on specific things to work on like the anatomy of the deltoids, at least when you're first starting out. I call these abstract principles, but because they are abstract, it can be hard to get what I'm talking about, because they're not always concrete. So let's use Michael Hampton's gesture drawings as an example, because he's very good at making something abstract a little easier to comprehend and treat as actionable, repeatable steps. Hampton can draw the gesture of a figure in 16 to 17 lines. As mentioned last time, this does not mean he draws random swoopy lines. Instead, every line is informed based on what he sees. But he says he's not drawing forms, or shapes, or contours. That means this line representing the arm does not represent the actual silhouette of the arm. Instead, it's an invisible, abstract interior line that merely represents the arm and the forces it's experiencing at a specific moment in time. That's clearly a much more difficult way to think about than just drawing the arm's silhouette, as we see it on the figure. I'm sure you'll agree, but this is what makes it more powerful. It's conceptual. Think of these as ways of seeing. You're just putting on your gesture glasses, and you'll eventually take them off and put on your silhouette glasses or your shape or form glasses, but all of them are just conceptual, just different ways of seeing and thinking about the human figure, or any other subject. I had spent a lot of time drawing silhouettes and contours, and I actually still think that this is probably one of the most powerful ways to think about the human figure, because it creates a highly understandable end result. But for working like Hampton, I've had to really unravel this to make it even more abstract over the last 100 hours and forget about perspective, anatomy, and other more concrete things for a little while. Yes, there is no perspective in these Hampton drawings. They are flat, 2D representations of forces, and how Hampton works through this is treating every line as either an I, C, or S curve. Unless we're dealing with a front-facing, evenly weighted figure, one side of the body is generally under compression, and therefore the other side of the body has to elongate and stretch. He treats the compressed side as asymmetric C-curves, maybe 2 or 3 of them, as this leads the eye along the figure in a pleasing way, using this alternating leapfrog-type arrangement. The opposite side will therefore have to be a gentle S-curve, probably singular, and it draws the eye right the way along the passive side of the body. He thinks about this for the torso initially, then the legs, dealing with the active weight-bearing side first, and finally the arms. In fact, every single time he draws, he does this sequence. Head, which is always just a flat circle, cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, stretched portion of the ribcage, weighted leg, passive leg, arms. Sequences or checklists are a pretty good way to learn to draw things because they give you a process that you can quickly run through to get a result. I would make an Anki card with this checklist on, and you'll be able to memorize it within just a couple of days and give yourself a tried, tested, repeatable way to successfully construct an entire figure at a very basic level. And this can then be built upon with more complex anatomy. If you want to get started in figure drawing, maybe this is your super fast, efficient way in. But there is a key thing you have to realize here. The thing we're really training here is not drawing these lines, but seeing them in the figure. It is a way of seeing that you are really learning here. I cannot emphasize that enough. It takes him maybe a minute to run through, and the end result is a figure that is gestural and appealing because we have used these visual pathways to guide the eye around the figure. We can change the things we don't like about the pose if we wish, and we can iterate on the figure because this is so fast to begin laying out in this way that it makes the figure disposable. If you dislike it, you just try again. It takes less than a minute. If we like what we see, then we jump on to the next step with some other way of seeing, like contour. But this initial way of interpreting the figure is powerful for setting up points of interest and making the figure feel rhythmic and alive. I've also had a lot of fun emphasizing different parts of the body. Like if I make the passive side really straight, how does that compare to making it more of a subtle S-curve? If I give the shoulders more of a curve, does that make the pose feel happier or sadder? In fact, this is the chief thing that Hampton says he plays with now in drawing: emotion and storytelling in pose. And it's really an interesting exercise to look at a photo of a posed figure and try to attach an emotion to it. For example, is this woman standing in a way that makes her seem elated or sad? Is she angry? What about her pose is making me interpret it as angry? As you work, try to make notes on this stuff because maybe one day you'll need to draw an angry character, and now you know how to instantly convey anger, or perhaps subtly convey it. When drawing a figure, he performs 2 checks, which are not always possible depending on the pose, but your legs, running from the feet to the pelvis, should be about the same size as the point from the pelvis to the top of the head, dividing your figure in half. This makes sure your proportions are good. He also drops a line straight down vertically from the pit of the neck, and this often lines up with the weighted leg or foot if you have a balanced figure. Sometimes he'll deliberately move the feet away from this point to make a figure feel more like it is in mid-movement. And so all the time you're building up these little tricks for drawing figures in action. Sometimes he draws a figure and then he tries to draw what they may have looked like a moment before or a moment after this pose, which means we can use what we have in the reference as kind of a half answer to help us imagine a new figure. I personally find these types of exercises to be very beneficial in learning to draw the human figure from imagination. I've mentioned it before, but I often take a reference pose and then draw it again from an imagined camera angle, and it's a great way to bridge the gap to fully imagined figures. I do also find that it requires a good grasp of perspective though, and Hampton does not cover that at this early phase of drawing people, so that's just something I think is important to know in order to avoid frustration. While Hampton does not include perspective at all, he does foreshorten his gesture lines, and the way that this works is you simply take your understanding of a proportioned body part. For example, the upper arm typically ends with the elbow in line with the lowest ribs, and you shorten that length. This automatically makes it appear as if we are looking more end-on down the length of the arm, something we call foreshortening. He says he used to use a cardboard toilet roll to help him figure the foreshortening out by matching the toilet roll to the orientation of the limb so that he can see how much the length shortens by, and also to aid in drawing the ellipses that he called wrapping lines, which he uses as a notation on the way the arm is positioned in space. Remember, there is no form and no outlines here. This is all just an abstraction, and so the ellipses are used more like a shorthand notation to remind himself, as the drawing develops later on, how the arm should be posed. It's hard to not see this as a form in perspective at times, though. I certainly struggle with that, because that's how I tend to draw anyway. But it's another way of thinking about the human figure, and therefore has its own value. Another thing to watch out for seems to be the level of finish in your drawings. Your finished gesture drawings shouldn't have any disconnected parts, but they also shouldn't be too fleshed out. There's this kind of sweet spot level of detail that is exemplified in his drawings, which is what I'm trying to replicate. It's just enough information to understand the pose well. So by studying Hampton and Fox and McMullen and Loomis and Hogarth and whoever else, what I'm finding is that I have a synthesis of anatomical approaches. That means I can see the Fox boxes and the Loomis curves and the Hampton 16 gesture lines, and now all of this different anatomy stuff is getting combined and synthesized in my head to create an outcome, and I can jump between and work on all these different ways of seeing. And anytime I want to draw a human being, it feels like putting on different pairs of glasses to see the figure in different ways. And while I still certainly have a long way to go, this is how I would describe the learning process so far in a way that you can hopefully appreciate. It's hard to describe these abstract things as concrete, but hopefully you can appreciate it at least a little bit now, but it really needs to be experienced for yourself by doing. I think that learning in this more general principle-focused way is better than being specific and worrying about details like how anime eyes should look. Just ask yourself, for example, would drawing anime eyes better make your drawings overall better than working on the abstract principles that I have just discussed here? I'll keep this bit brief because I spoke about it a lot last time, but we like maximizing learning effectiveness here, and I think that the reason you should be hatching when learning to draw is because it's actually one of the most efficient ways to train. This is because it teaches you about line weight, line control, value, and how to see and follow the undulating forms and volumes of your subjects all at the same time. This can be a lot to manage at first, so I would stick to the following order of operations. Line weight and control should be first. That is, just hatching however you want until you're able to draw lines under control and get used to the hatching motion. Once you can just make decent hatch lines, which should not take too long, upgrade the difficulty by trying to make your hatch bundles follow the surface directions that you can observe. This requires more care because you have to be able to see how the surface is leaning or bulging and map that with the angle that you draw your hatch lines at. For curved surfaces, you'll need smaller lengths that angle change more rapidly. Finally, we have value. Once you can map surfaces well, you need to try to make your hatching match what you see in terms of light and dark. This involves changing the distance between the hatch lines or cross-hatching carefully in a way that doesn't throw out the careful planar directions you've worked hard to establish. Over time, you'll be able to spin all these different plates at once and draw some very appealing looking stuff. I currently struggle a lot with the form aspect and a lot with the value aspect, so I'm trying to make those steps even simpler. I found it best to break a reference image or scene down into 3, maybe 4 values. First, we decide how to hatch each value, and this means that we create a sample that we can refer to and use in the final drawing. Then we draw the image using 2 of the values. I use the white of the page and the lightest hatch value. After that, we darken some parts of our already hatched zones to bring in values 3 and 4. You cannot lighten hatching, only darken it. So this approach makes the most sense, but we do have to tread a little softly and not do too much right away. It's also a great way to learn to control your tools, and you can use pencils, pens, nibs, or even a fine paintbrush to hatch with. So go and hatch with your weapon of choice and level up all these skills at once. Work smarter, not harder. The only downside I can think of to this so far is that hatching a drawing takes ages, but the more you practice it, the faster you get. These drawings all took around 30 minutes from start to finish. I use that term with a pinch of salt because it's not what I want to be, but it did feel like it a lot for the last 100 hours as I really tried to wrap my brain around how light is working when we look at objects, how our eyes and brains use it, what color really is, and how to simulate all of that on paper or in Photoshop to make some very basic scenes from imagination painted to a fairly believable level. One of the things I talk about occasionally is the Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, and we've actually used it a lot already in this video for breaking down things like gesture and hatching. But the idea is that you want to spend your time doing the least amount of work, that magic 20% that will give you the majority or 80% of the skill or result that you need. And this often translates to simply practicing generic abstract principles, which is why I make such a big thing about it. But this is a good point to show you a more specific, concrete example. If you were to pick one form to get good at rendering and to improve your painting skills as fast as possible, what would you pick and why? I'll give you the option of a cube, a cylinder, sphere, cone, or pyramid. How to think about it? Well, the answer is the sphere. You might have thought the answer would be boxes, and I would have thought that too. After all, when learning to draw, the answer for which of these to spend time on is definitely boxes, because they make all the other things easier to draw. So why is it now spheres when we make the jump to painting? Well, firstly, spheres demonstrate the truest lighting in any scene that we place them in. A box will show us where the lights are, but only how it relates to 3 directions around the box. And this is because we can only see up to 3 sides of any box, no matter how we rotate it. But a sphere allows us to much more clearly do a bit of detective work and work out exactly where the light source or sources are in relation to that sphere. The second reason is that they are actually quite hard to render. Boxes are easy. It's just a flat value on each side, maybe a little value shift just to make things a bit more realistic or some bounce light, but not a lot more is required than that. Spheres, on the other hand, require you to actually be able to gradually blend values across a form in a way that makes it feel spherical, and I found this pretty tough to do when I first started out. The solution, as outlined in the book Color and Light by 3D Total, is actually to paint the sphere with hard value bands initially and then blend them later, and so this is what I did. And you can actually use angles relative to the light source to figure out where these values should go on the sphere. If we treat the sphere as a side view and imagine the light shining from the top, we know that anything beyond the widest tangent of this circle, as it now appears, is in shadow. And we also know from previous videos about the 50% rule. This means if we have a white sphere, we can now paint this rearward half with a 50% grey, and that will be the darkest shadow tone. We now have two values, and in a stylized painting, if you work quite cartoony or quite graphic, this might be enough. But let's keep going. This upper portion now needs to run from 50% grey to 100% white in order to really feel rounded. So how do we divide up this hemisphere into those in-between grey values? There are ways to work this out using angles, but I hate those, and so we'll subdivide instead. If we divide this upper portion into half, we get 100% white for the top and then 75% grey for the bottom. We can then just divide each of these bands into half again and fill them in with values at 50% respectively. This will give, in general, a realistically lit sphere. This is another process or checklist that we can quickly run through to get a consistent and repeatable end result every time. You can make an Anki card about this process to get you practicing it, and after just a few sessions you'll have it internalized and it will just be how you paint things. If we want to shift the light source, we can do so to wherever we want, and this relationship will just stay exactly the same because spheres are a totally uniform surface. Pretty cool, huh? All you need to understand is this one lighting model, and now you can paint anything. By the way, to make things more realistic, actually the back shadow side would get a little bit of fill light, which I normally have at around 10% brighter than my shadow value, but you can play with this. It also means that the point where the tangent is, which is called the terminator in most literature, becomes the only part of the sphere to show the darkest value, and this is because the least light is hitting this area. It's perpendicular to the direction of the direct light source. This changes for local light sources, like candles and things like that, because depending on how bright the light is, we might have to shift all of this upwards to make less of the sphere lit up. When working in 3D, it's also a little different, but if you have enough knowledge of perspective to be able to visualize where a light is relative to your sphere, then you can work out where these bands would go and set up the sphere to be lit with values that correspond to lighting in your scene. So like this, perhaps, if the light was over back behind my left shoulder somewhere. All of this is well and good, but it gets even better. Because let's say that now we want to paint something really complex, like a scene with multiple objects. We can now just literally color pick from the sphere and work out how the lighting would be on any plane in the image. See this box? I can just pick from the sphere at a spot which roughly aligns with the surface normals of the faces, and that spot on the sphere will be the same value as the box plane. So we can leverage the 80-20 principle here by taking the simplest lighting model and reusing it infinitely to make any painting we want, or at least to use as a helpful guide to get started. Painting one sphere enables you to paint an entire image, and because it can be done very quickly, it's disposable. You can test out different lighting setups very quickly without sacrificing any progress in the actual painting. You could even use a program like Blender to make the sphere lit exactly how you want, and then just dump it into Photoshop and color pick from that if you really wanted to. But I recommend putting in this time to get good at painting things manually, because if I can do it within 3 months training for just 1 hour a day, then you can too. Now this is still quite a simplistic version of lighting that I am describing here. I've also spent some time studying things like light fall-off and how local light sources differ to direct ones, and so this is something that I would treat as a gentle introduction to working with your own lit scenes from imagination. The other thing you might be saying is, yeah, okay, 10K, but who paints in grey? I want to paint in colour. Well, me too, and if you take a look at my last Street Fighter benchmark test painting, you'll see that the colours went all weird last time. When I painted that, I tried to be like Kelly Daly or Ross Draws and all the other cool kids that use Photoshop and bring in all these layer tricks and digital workarounds. I would paint in grey first, and then use a colour layer on top to make my values magically become wonderful Technicolor. It did not work. Now I know why, so let me share it with you. I mentioned a moment ago the 50% rule. This means that when painting over here on the left side of the Photoshop color picker, we can work out any shadow value by just halving where we are vertically in the triangle. If we have a dark grey box, the shadow side will be 50% of that dark grey. If it's white, it will be 50% of white. This is dependable and works for all digital art, but it's a little tougher to do in materials like gouache because the values change as they dry, but the same principle can be applied. But colour does not behave like this, and it requires a different approach. When you put a colour layer over your work, like these grey boxes, what happens is it literally translates the greys to colours in the triangle. So if I have a light grey, when I paint it red with a colour layer, instead of getting a deep punchy red, I get this washed out weird pink red. I encountered this on the Street Fighter painting by trying to paint things like skin, and it never coming out peachy and golden. So now I don't use any layer tricks. I paint everything manually, and I can do this now because I actually understand at least a little bit of the optical physics behind how colors should change. These cubes should be painted in whatever color I want them to be first, their so-called local color. So we'll use some punchy high chroma colors. On the Photoshop color picker triangle here, you can see that these are all way over to the right. The color layer in Photoshop was making the colors more tinted, like up here somewhere, and really washed out. Instead, this very rightward-leaning high chroma color is the value for the lightest, most sun-kissed part of our form. To find the shadow, we draw a diagonal line from black to this spot on the picker, and then we grab the 50% color. This, as mentioned in the 600-hour recap, is called a saturation path, and it's how colors darken in shadow, losing chroma to eventually become black. Any color you pick as your local color, anywhere on this picker, even a washed-out pink, we'll just use this diagonal path to drop towards black. So now you can use a slightly modified version of the 50% rule to paint anything, in any color. Hooray! And once again, there are things I'm not addressing here, like hue shift, and bounce light, and emotion, and all that other stuff. If you're totally baffled by how artists make their digital paintings look good, this is a great and easy way to start, and then you can worry about all the other stuff later. Just render some basic forms using this and have fun with it. From this point, I started to look at a few other things because my forms still felt a bit flat, a bit dead. And the biggest thing that I think is an absolute requirement is casting shadows. These cubes are all floating in space, and that never feels as satisfying or believable as a form that is attached to a ground plane, casting a shadow across it. It also helps to really show where the light source is that we're painting and how bright it is. And this can be made even more convincing by painting your objects, casting shadows, onto other objects. Now, casting shadows is actually a little bit tough. It requires the same fairly advanced skill in perspective drawing that you require to draw boxes and other things from imagination well, because a light like the sun, way off in the distance, is really just a vanishing point, but a very bright one. We can use parallel lines passing through the corners of any forms we draw to show how their shadows would align with the light source. What I'm doing here is I'm imagining the light source on the floor as a vanishing point, and I'm firing lines to off-screen. Then we can decide how high the light source is, and for this I imagine the same vanishing point being up in the sky as the sun. These new lines represent light rays that are firing out from it, and they hit the boundaries of my forms, and where these lines intersect the floor lines, we get the outline of a shadow. This gets a lot harder when we have rotated forms, or when we have forms floating into space, because we have to be good enough at perspective to project points down to the floor to work a lot of this out. And I find that I sometimes have to spend maybe upwards of 30 minutes plotting these shadows out on very complex arrangements. And it can end up very confusing with a lot of lines in the painting. So I decided to color code them. So I use red for the light direction lines and then blue for the light angle lines. Also, although I'm showing these lines as parallel here, for a light source like a candle, the lines would radiate a lot more from where the light source is because it's much closer. But for a beginner learning, just deal with sunlight. And the reason for this is that you can reduce cognitive load by just literally drawing two lines, one red and one blue, and duplicating them around your scene. Easy. Shadows will be at 50% of whatever color the surface is that they hit. So you know how to fill those in now. But there's one more thing I do, and that is that the further the shadow extends from an object, the softer it gets. The brighter the light source you use, the less this will happen. But if you want to make natural looking shadows, I would use a soft brush or even the smudge tool and fire lines by holding down Shift to make the shadow boundary go from hard to soft along the length of its edges. The next thing we need is ambient occlusion. This is pretty simple, but it helps a lot to make things look more believable, so it's worth including. The idea here is that where a form touches the floor or gets quite close to something else, there's less room for the light to bounce around. And so particularly where surfaces meet, we get these very dark shadows, maybe 10 to 20% in value, but they're never down at 0% in pure black. You can paint these in with a soft brush as a super fine line, and then I often find I need to smudge them a tiny bit too just to soften them back slightly. All I'm using here, by the way, are the hard and soft default Photoshop brushes, and for the soft brush, when I want it really soft, I turn on pen pressure, and I also sometimes drop the brush opacity manually using the number keys. This gives you more control in building your values up or down slowly. The next thing we need is value shift, and this is the idea that no planes of an object are all one single value. So when I paint, I try to shift the value by maybe 2 to 5% and softly brush one side to be lighter or darker. I also sometimes use the gradient tool. I might make the side furthest from the light darker or the side closest to the light brighter, but try not to overdo this or you'll end up with some very strange looking paintings. The same thing can also be done with hue generally, but at this stage of my learning, I currently omit that for now, but be aware of it. Finally, I do some bounce light, which might mean making a side facing a lit plane like the ground 10% lighter where the light is bouncing up and just making it glow slightly. And again, this is very subtle. A key lesson has been to realize that every single thing you paint is actually also a light source. So bounce light will generally always be present in any painting, especially those with a very strong light source like sunlight. Soft brushes have given me the best results for controlling some of these subtle effects, but it's very easy to go too soft, and that's a mistake I make all the time. My current fix for this is to work for as long as I can using a hard round brush, and I only bring in a soft brush when I feel it's the only way to solve that particular problem. It seems like it's far easier to make hard forms softer than it is to make soft forms harder, which actually seems to require total repainting of the object with a hard brush. There are a lot of things I still don't know yet, like how translucent materials work, or how reflections work, or how to render metallic objects, but I'll get to that soon. In the meantime, I want to talk about one other aspect of this, which is that when I began painting these from imagination, I found that there were moments where things still felt off or not quite right, especially when dealing with stuff I was less familiar with. More indirect lighting like bounce light, stuff like that. I wasn't sure I was actually painting it as it should really look, and so my solution was to try and build the scenes I wanted to paint using these little wooden toy blocks. I got these from a toy shop and I just spray painted them white, grey and black, a mixture of each. And I would place them in areas near windows or on the floor or in the middle of the room to see how the light hit them and try to paint that. Remember, I'm a strong believer that observation is actually the best way to learn how to work from imagination. And all this technical stuff I'm describing is just a way of managing the actual recreation of what I have observed. This is so boring to look at, I know, but trust me when I say that just from painting toy wooden blocks within a 30-minute training session, I learned so much. It's crazy. Once you have some knowledge from a book like Colour and Light, you're able to see something and break down what you're observing into terms you have understood from the book. And often you find it doesn't work exactly as the book says, but instead it's much more subtle, and so you have your next difficulty tier to work on. For example, I've found that in interior environments, actually a lot of indirect lighting does behave as a direct light, but it's just softer, presumably because the light is still strong enough and bouncing around from a single surface enough to cast a direct type shadow, but with a very soft edge. When you really stop to study something highly specific like how the shadow sides are lit with bounce light, you find all sorts of broken rules. Like that 50% rule I talked about. It's not always the case. The rule definitely helps as a general thing to get a general result, but when observing, you'll often have to deviate from it. So therefore, maybe our imagined scene should do the same, right? The biggest thing was that in setting up the light and how the shadows were cast in imagined scenes, I would often not have planned ahead well enough, and so instead of interesting shadow shapes, I would end up with all the shadow shapes overlapping and forming a mass of boring darkness. When I placed my wooden blocks though, I could arrange them freely to just make cool shadows before starting to paint, and the end result was always something far better than anything I could possibly imagine. So this led me to ask another question. What's the point of painting from imagination when we can just make what we want to paint in real life and then paint it? So this felt like a bit of a self-doubt moment. I've just invested a bunch of time into learning how to do all of this with no reference, and then when I do use reference, it gives me better results. So why not just always use reference? I decided to research this more and found something really interesting, which is that throughout history, most artists that painted imagined scenes did indeed stage their scenes and paint using props, but not completely. Let me explain. The book I used to investigate this further was Imaginary Realism by James Gurney, and in the book he describes how he will paint characters for his science fiction or fantasy projects using real-life props. I mean, he actually uses things like toy dinosaurs or monsters that he sculpted from clay to figure out the lighting, and the reasons for that should be obvious from what I just told you. You can very simply move your dinosaur about and find the coolest shadow shapes, or make the light kind of half hit it and get some cool lit areas, or some sweet bounce light. And that's the stuff that's very hard to imagine in the first place, let alone paint. The most extreme example of this I could find, and it really is extreme, was Theodore Géricault. And between 1818 and 1819, he painted one of the world's most iconic paintings, The Raft of the Medusa. The Medusa was a French ship that got into trouble and sank, and the survivors ended up on a life raft, turning to cannibalism to stay alive before eventually being rescued. It was a horrific story that captured the attention of the French people at the time, and you have to remember that this was in the days before photos, or even proper news bureaus. Today we just see things happening live on Instagram or whatever, but back then all stories were really just word of mouth, or printed on paper, and so pictures of these things were very much non-existent. Artists like Géricault would try to imagine what these scenes were like and paint them. And painting imaginary scenes to demonstrate events like this goes right the way back to the Renaissance when artists would be paid to paint imagined versions of biblical scenes. A painting is worth 1,000 words after all, especially in a time when less than 10% of the population can actually read the Bible. So how did Géricault paint this iconic masterpiece? Well, first he interviewed the survivors, and then he built a real full-size raft and hired models and gave them costumes. And then he went to his local mortician and got some severed heads and hands and feet to paint so that he could observe how bodies looked as they decomposed. And then he sketched and sketched and sketched and painted the scene numerous times, working out all these little compositional problems using his collection of severed body parts and costumed models before painting a final version. It took him like 2 years. Crazy. I don't have that kind of spare time, but it does show you just what is required to get something as good as this. But more importantly, how much of this painting is now from imagination? It's more like Géricault imagined the scene he wanted to depict, and then built it up like a movie set, and then just painted the movie set. So are we now dealing with imagination or observation? This was discussed over in the Discord server, and people more knowledgeable than myself pointed out that often the artist would do all of these preliminary studies, but then paint the final version genuinely from imagination. No cheatsies by looking at the reference, which should be easier to do, I guess, because they've already painted the image like 65 times as a study. There are loads of examples of this throughout art history, and I would love to know which figures were referenced and which were imagined in the artworks that I love by artists like Vasquez or Raphael. It seems that on average, models and props were used to help figure things out most of the time, even if that is not how the final painting was actually made. There are artists who still work like this today, such as James Gurney, and Alex Ross, who dresses dudes up as Batman to paint DC comic covers. There are also a lot of concept artists in the industry today who literally just paint over 3D models. So maybe I'm setting the bar too high here. Maybe I should instead be creating real physical things or 3D models to eventually study and paint, instead of working so hard on trying to just spontaneously make imagined scenes from nothing. But then there are a different bunch, the artists or perhaps designers who really do just imagine things there and then and bring them to life on paper. I'm talking about people like Sid Mead or Kim Jung-gi or James Jean, who just churn out bizarre things with no reference at all, no models and no props, like a tiger riding a tricycle. It's just fabricated right there on the drawing or painting surface. And these images are much more like seeing into someone's brain. They aren't so much trying to show us a photorealistic depiction of an event like Géricault was, but just get out the crazy stuff in their heads and put it on paper to share with the world. And this actually interests me far more. Like, this is what I want to be able to do. I labeled these different versions as staged imagination and pure imagination, but clearly this more difficult, more pure imaginary process is possible too. It seems that the difference perhaps lies in the level of realism required. No matter how good we are at imagining things, they will never be as real as reality, and maybe that's why Géricault spent 2 years building his movie set. So if it's reality you want, maybe just make the thing for real and paint it. Then again, if you want things to be more trippy, then using your imagination will produce the things that maybe reality never could. Besides, who has the time and budget to build rafts and bring home dead bodies? Certainly not me. But we can't get tigers to ride bikes either, not that I've tried, so how does someone like Kim Jung-gi possess the ability to come up with these totally never-before-seen things? Clearly, it involves being able to draw tigers and bikes really well from imagination, having studied them. And so in many ways, I think that he and Géricault were not that different. The common thread between them then is repetition of study time with particular subjects, and that might be tigers or decomposing body parts. For my simple entry into this realm of imaginary painting, I started with some wooden blocks, and I can sort of paint something from imagination with my understanding of perspective and the inverse square law and saturation paths and stuff like that. But even with all of this knowledge, the results were never as good as what gets generated when you set up a real scene to paint, at least for me so far. I'll keep mixing this study from observation with my imaginary exercises, and I'm making a conscious effort to really remember and internalize the lessons I learned from observing so I can bring them into the imagined work. I find topics like this really fascinating to think about because the problems have to be kind of reified and worked into actual, actionable steps that can be followed to reach that particular goal. That means if I want to be able to draw and paint from pure imagination, then really the thing I need to be training is my imagination and my ability to think of these things in the first place, so that I can use what I do know about depicting reality to at least make it feel somewhat believable. This is like the other end of the cycle that I have already started. I currently use observation to kind of power my ability to make things look more realistic from imagination. Let's call this staged imagination, but it does not answer the question of, if I can do it, what do I draw? What should I imagine in the first place? I need to train up pure imagination, which brings me to my next point. One of the things that I constantly get criticized for on this channel is a lack of finished artworks, and many of you remind me every time I release a video that I could probably get better quicker by producing paintings that take like 20 hours to complete, because a lot of what will be learned through that process will be beneficial. And you are correct in that it would be helpful, but there are a couple of reasons why I only do this a few times a year. The first and most important is that I am deliberately not doing it to see what results can be obtained with no finished painting practice, by just doing hyper-focused drills. If we already know what happens when somebody does finished paintings, then what happens if they don't? That's what this channel is for, so that's the principal reason why. After probably hour 1000 or so, I will begin to also work on finished projects, and then we'll see what kind of lessons they bring. So yes, I do hear you, and I will take your advice, but there's a reason I am not doing so for a little while longer. There is another reason as well though, and it's one that makes me a little bit unique amongst other people that tackle this subject. That is that I have no intention of being an artist. I don't want to work in the concept art industry. I don't want to sell my paintings. I don't want to bring my stories to life. And unlike 99% of the people who make this type of content, I don't work in the industry. I have no tips to help you get a job as a concept artist. I'm just a dude that likes learning hard things, and I wanted to learn to draw and paint. Therefore, I don't have a goal beyond that. And so finished projects just aren't really important to me other than being a periodic way to test my progress. That being said, in preparation for eventually bringing in some sort of finished projects to work on and learn from, and to try and inspire myself to begin working more in pure imagination, I have begun to think about what sort of things interest me and what I might like to do with my painting and drawing skills once they improve. Now, this is something that a lot of you probably had before even starting to learn art. It's like your crazy ideas for comics or games or whatever were the thing that made you want to draw. But I'm the polar opposite of that. I've gotten a little bit better at making art, and now I have to come up with something to test it out on. We'll refer to this as inspiration, and I currently have none of it. No ideas whatsoever. And this is in contrast to artists like Kim Jung-gi, who can just come up with ideas for things to draw, really sometimes quite crazy things, at the drop of a hat. I cannot do that yet, and I need to be able to, so I need to inspire myself somehow now, and that's a really interesting abstract challenge to have to deal with for the first time. It makes me ask all sorts of questions like, is the art these guys produce a result of their upbringing, or a result of their life experience? How did these images end up in their head in the first place? Or perhaps how did the ingredients for them end up in their head in the first place? I also think this line of questioning is related to, but perhaps not exactly the same thing as, questions related to developing a personal aesthetic style for your art. I've mentioned this before, but I did draw as a kid. My brother and I would often sit at the kitchen table and we would draw artwork from video game manuals. You see, back in the 90s, video games always came with a little instruction manual filled with artwork of the characters, and we love games like Mega Man X and Pokemon. So we used to try and copy the characters from the manuals. Once they started showing anime in the UK, stuff like Dragon Ball Z, we used to copy those too. But that was about as far as drawing ever went. But recently, I often find even as an adult, when working on my studies, sometimes I'll suddenly think back to those Pokemon from back in the day, because they had some cool shapes, and that might be something fun to paint, especially when working with gouache and testing out colours and things like that. I also seem to have this weird thing for drawing mechs and robots, and I have no idea where that came from. I always end up going down these Pinterest rabbit holes of robots that people have built, and they have all these highly detailed parts, and so there must be some sort of game or toy-related memory remnant that I'm tapping into there. The stuff I loved as a kid, but lost during my transition into adulthood. And of course, I love looking at the work produced by other artists, things like the art for card games, or classical paintings, graphic design, comics. But this really runs such a vast gamut of material, styles, and media that I think it's really more just an appreciation for craftsmanship and high-level skill than anything specific, if that makes sense. I'd love to know what inspires you guys and whether your inspirations lead to you studying art or vice versa. So please let me know in the comments, because I think this will help me navigate this issue a lot more easily. And it would be cool to hear what sort of things inspire you generally and what way around you learn to bring your imaginations to life. It's a brand new year, full of opportunity and a great time to start building new habits. And this is something that I've been asked a bit about recently, and I do intend to make a longer video dealing with just this aspect of learning. But it's an important and often overlooked region of the learning process. And that is, how do we, with our busy adult lives, ensure we can set aside some time, preferably every day, to commit to learning and make sure we feel fresh enough that it sinks in? Now, I personally dislike it when you hear these motivational type YouTubers who just tell you to make more time. If you're a working mother of 3, you cannot make more time, and it's really quite harsh, honestly, to suggest that everyone can just get up a bit earlier or go to bed a bit later or whatever, when literally every spare second you have will be spent either making ends meet or taking care of your family. So I will not tell you to do that because I am painfully aware of how tough it can be to find time when life throws everything at you. My first step into time management was to use Google Calendar to record literally everything I did for 2 weeks. I got the idea from this from Noah Kagan, and it meant that every activity, including time spent eating meals, scrolling on my phone, working, playing video games, spending time with my family, everything I did, I logged down to see how long I spent doing these things in an average week. After 2 weeks, I was a little shocked to see that I was spending probably way too long doing things like playing video games or looking at social media. From this point, I tried to create a schedule in Google Calendar to stick to for 2 weeks. If you spend 10 hours a week playing video games at 2 hours per day, then just maybe allow yourself 1 hour of gaming after doing 1 hour of drawing. That way, instead of having to make time, you're just making more structured use of time that you already have without ever having to give up gaming altogether. You might even decide that actually you don't care that much about drawing, you just want to do a little bit. And so you'll just dedicate 2 hours to drawing per week, reducing your gaming time to 8 hours. Now, this is not an instant fix, and I still have to massage and tweak my calendar all the time as my work schedule and life changes. But it's just a pretty good habit to have, I think, to take ownership of what you spend your time doing, and it offers you a fascinating insight into your habits and interests and priorities. I was spending on one construction job I did 4 hours a day driving, and that is soul destroying. But you know what I did? I started listening to audiobooks on learning, and that is actually how I learned a lot of this stuff in the first place, while sitting in traffic on the M25. Don't try to create time, just see if you can somehow make better use of your time. That's all I'm saying. Also, you don't have to do all of your learning in one go. Perhaps you should, because actually that might be how your brain best learns things like art. But I regularly break my day up into 2 30-minute study sessions instead of a 1-hour session. I can only study in the evenings usually due to my job, and it generally means my drawing has to be done before bed. And I think this is actually not great for me personally, because quite often I'm pretty tired, and I know I do not learn as well when I've been using my brain all day. On days when I am off work, I do so much better when I train in the morning because I feel fresh. But evenings is the only way that I can really make this work and film it. So it is what it is. I am still improving, so it can't be that bad. The other potential upside of training in the evening is that there are studies to suggest that learning shortly before sleep or a long nap helps the connections in the brain that actually constitute the physical effects of learning and skill acquisition to form more strongly. It's like your brain prioritizes the stuff it did maybe 2 hours before sleep to really internalize. I don't know for a fact that this is what's happening with me, but hey, play around with it and see for yourself. It's called memory consolidation if you want to learn more about it, but as I say, I will make a video about all of this stuff at some point. It could be that just changing the time of day that you train has a huge impact on your learning experience. This time management is the only way it's been personally possible for me to train for 1 hour a day and have a job and have a family and produce content for a YouTube channel and 2 other social media accounts and a Discord server, so it does work. I set time aside to reply to comments, to write scripts, to record videos, to edit videos. You get the idea. Over time, I get a feel for how long a task takes, and I stick to the time slots. I will literally set a 1-hour timer, and if I give myself 1 hour to record a voiceover and it doesn't get done, I stop. It just means next time I need to give myself more time or chop the task up into 2 sessions across 2 days or something, whatever. I learn as I go. If all you can manage is 1 hour per week, that's better than nothing, and actually it might be the very best place to start and ease yourself back into this if you haven't done it for a while, or you just want to see if you enjoy it or not. It is, after all, an investment of your time, and you get to choose what you invest your time in. You learn as you go, and then you flag any issues that need fixing. You apply what you learn to improve, exactly the same process as I do when learning any skill, like drawing. Because I use Anki, I also do not have to dedicate any time at all to figuring out what to study each day. It just tells me. So I just sit down, do a card or two, and make my notes for the day. It does take a degree of discipline, which is another kind of aspect of all this that we won't get into here, and a calendar won't be for everyone. But I do really want to emphasize that I am not a slave to the calendar. I do not use it as any more than a rough guide to plan my week. I am only human, and of course I have days when I can't do everything or things get rolled back to a later date. Be kind to yourself, friends, but play with these tools to see what version of them, if any, are useful to you. Remember, all of it, is just about experimenting, playing with things, and learning how you learn. Keep what is useful and reject what is not, as a wise man once said. Here are all of the paintings and drawings I've completed over the last 100 hours. There are a lot of digital studies in there this time, most of them actually pretty boring to look at, but to be honest, these were really strong learning opportunities. This isn't the kind of work that you see on social media or in people's portfolios because it's just not fun to look at. But I want you to see it because what it does show is the fruits of the actual learning process. This is hours and hours spent just thinking about where that light is coming from, drawing the forms in perspective from an imagined camera angle, plotting where the shadows would go, and then painting them and trying to really simulate how the light and color would behave. This experimentation is the same as cooking a recipe a bunch of times to tweak the flavors until they're just right, or going to the mats every day to make that one jujitsu technique smooth and efficient. I know what I want and I chase it every day, reviewing what I learned after every session and using that information to set the next session up. Stack enough of these up and you hit your goal. It's just literally a matter of time, and you can do it in just 1 hour per day. I still have a long way to go and a lot more to learn, but I am enjoying myself, and that's the main thing. The paper I've been drawing on this time was mostly layout paper, which is not great, but I refuse to ever throw a piece of paper away now. Layout paper is really thin, and it's designed for iterating on drawings by being thin enough to trace over. The idea is you draw a sports car or whatever and then place a fresh piece of paper on top to refine or even alter your drawing. It's mentioned a lot in the Scott Robertson book How to Draw, and the best thing about it is that it's super cheap, so if you want to burn through a lot of material, it's very cost effective. The downside to it though is that it's so thin, your pens and pencils won't react well unless you have exactly the right surface underneath it. If it's rock hard like a tabletop, you'll find that your pens just skid or produce these horrible, really shaky lines, and if the surface underneath is too soft, the paper might tear. What seems to work best is having a sketch pad underneath, a stack of papers, or in my case, a sheet or two of thicker card. That works to allow the paper to compress just enough that the tips of your art tools can glide around nicely, and then you actually have quite a nice surface to draw on. The reason I draw on individual sheets like this and not the pad itself is that when you draw on the pad, the lines on the surface compress through the pad down onto the rest of it, and so your next few sheets of paper will have these horrible marks in them, a bit like an engraving, that will make it very hard to do things like shading the paper in and cause your lines to skip. Of course, all of this can be avoided by just using better paper, but I thought I'd mention it in case you all rush out to buy a pad of layout paper. I didn't use many new materials this time, apart from some Bic Crystal ballpoint pens in different colours, which are just a bit of fun, really. It's pretty cool doing your figure drawings in neon pink to mix things up. A lot of you in the comments have rated Bic Crystals very highly as the best ballpoint pen on the market for drawing, and I have to agree with you, they are very good. My current favourite though is the Papermate Inkjoy, which I have mentioned before on this channel I think. Most ballpoint pens have a 1mm tip, but the Inkjoy I use has a 0.7mm tip, which is much finer. And it's a lot more like drawing with a manga pen nib really, so you can create these super delicate lines, and I really enjoy that at the moment, especially when hatching and drawing from observation. Apparently there is a version with a 0.5mm tip, so I might try and get that soon too. I'm sure Bic probably do finer pen tips than 1mm if I look, but if you have any other tool or paper recommendations, I always love to hear them. As mentioned in the 600-hour recap, I'm currently experimenting with studying deep over broad, and having spent the last 100 hours really pushing to make my rendering and painting better, I feel like I'm at a point where this should be tested with another finished painting. As such, I will be reviewing this information with Anki, but I'm going to be deep diving into a different topic this time in an effort to improve, and that's anatomy. I feel like my anatomy drawings have stagnated a bit because while I have been reviewing anatomy and gradually improving, I haven't really brought in any new material for a while. So what would happen if I learned a new piece of anatomy knowledge every day and spent 1 hour drawing the human figure every day? How much could I improve my imaginary figure drawings by before I hit the 800-hour mark? That sounds like a fun challenge, and I'm down, so check back in at 800 hours to see how I got on. Any advice, tips, criticism, or whatever else you have is always more than welcome in the comments. I'll try and put some ideas or training drills up as challenges over on the world's biggest art learning experiment Discord server, so you can try some of these for yourself. Keep an eye out for more videos soon. Thank you so much for watching today, and I wish you all the very best with your own studies.